the reality is in Australia for the last 30 years, there's never been a good time to have a wage rise, and it's worked. That's why we've had low wage growth. Yeah. That's why the wage share is lowest as a percentage of GDP as it's almost ever been. So, yeah, it's interesting the way these kind of accidents just keep repeating themselves. But, yeah, we're accidentally pushing for wage restraint again.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today, as the 47th Parliament sits for the first time, climate change is first on the legislative agenda. But there are new inflation figures due out tomorrow, and the day after that, Treasurer Jim Chalmers will deliver an economic statement to the Parliament, widely tipped to be, well, shall we say, dire. All of that will put cost of living pressures and inflation firmly on the national economic agenda. Many listeners will have heard politicians, business leaders, commentators warning the Treasurer about a wages spiral, with the Australian Financial Review editorial advocating that Labor must do whatever it takes to fight inflation.
From the Australian Financial Review joins us now. John, how bad is inflation going to get, you reckon?
Yeah, morning guys. Well, the Consumer Price Index is tipped to hit 6.3% this week when it comes out.
The consideration was that inflation's high. At the moment it's 5%, and by the end of the year I expect inflation to get to 7%.
At the moment, wage growth is 2.4% and inflation is 5.1%. Wage growth isn't even half.
If we raise the interest rates too fast and too much, we will have a global recession.
Inflation is not being driven by high wage growth. How do we know this? We don't have high wage growth.
My message to Australians is inflation will get worse before it gets better, but it will get better.
But what really is driving inflation in Australia? To break it all down, I'm joined by the Australia Institute's Chief Economist and soon-to-be Executive Director, Richard Dennis. G'day, Richard.
Hey, Eb. Got promoted on air.
You did. It's very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you first up, whatever it takes from the Financial Review. I mean, that's pretty strong there. By that, do they mean?
Well, I guess whatever it takes. I mean, when something big like climate change comes along, of course, we should be very cautious. We shouldn't rush in. We should wait. We shouldn't spend any money on tackling climate change in case we don't need it. But when something big like inflation comes along, whatever it takes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, look, inflation, it's better to live in a society that has lower inflation than high. It's a bit easier. It's a bit simpler. But, the costs of unemployment are enormous. The costs of climate change are enormous. The costs of inequality in Australia, Indigenous disadvantage, they're enormous. Costs of inflation, yeah, they're not zero. But yeah, this is not a crisis, and it's very interesting the way we're seeing some commentators say that inflation is the biggest problem we face, when we've got the world scientists saying, a few other ones.
Yeah. I mean, you've made a good point there. Whatever it takes. I don't think I've seen a Financial Review headline for that about climate change. But I also don't think...
It'll come good. There could be upsides.
There could be. I also don't think the Financial Review means... I don't really think they mean whatever it takes when it comes to fighting inflation.
No, they mean whatever it takes workers.
Yeah.
Yeah, they think that in the fight against inflation, workers should accept real wage cuts. And what that means is that wage growth lower than prices growth. So if you earned $1,000 a week and prices of things went up 10%, but your wages only went up 5%, you'd get a $50 a week wage rise. But your real wage, your ability to go out and buy stuff would be lower. So, yeah, it's interesting when people say we should do whatever it takes to tackle inflation. Does that mean crack down on company profits? Fine. Does that mean, have competition policy that actually works? Yeah, sign me up for that. No, most people saying we should do whatever it takes means that you should do whatever it takes. You should get a real wage cut so that I can have lower inflation.
Yeah. You have recently done some research about what is actually driving inflation in Australia. As I mentioned, we hear that it's wages that are driving inflation and that we've got to crack down on wages, but that's not really what the data found, is it?
No, it's not true at all. So there's a couple of things, and this is sort of widely known. I'll come to our research in a second, but the Australian Bureau of Statistics publishes the share of GDP that goes to profits and the share that goes to wages. Profit shares at record high, wage shares at record low. So there's a bit of a hint there. It's not wages that are driving the bus, according to that bit of data. Australian Bureau of Statistics has also got data on what's happened to just wages growth in Australia. And actually, for the last 10 years, wages have been growing at record low levels. So as share of GDP, we know it's not wages. Just trend in wage rises, we know it's not wages. And we've added a third piece of evidence. The first two should be compelling, but for those that wanted more, we've dished it up. And what we've been able to do is following a method developed by the European Central Bank, so the European...
Credible, you might say.
Well, the equivalent of the RBA, Australia's Reserve Bank for all of Europe.
Yeah.
So, radical lefties. The Germans in particular are known for their radical approach. So the European Central Bank came up with a very clever method which allowed them to sort of break down through the national accounts exactly what share of the broadest measure of inflation we have, something called the GDP deflator, what share of that was being driven by wage growth. And what the European Central Bank found was that for Europe, it was profits, not wages, driving European inflation. So Dave Richardson here at the Institute thought, well, why don't we do that for Australia? And we did. And guess what? In Australia, wages account for even less and profits account for far more of our inflation than the Europeans found. And, in round numbers, only around 15% of the recorded inflation could be attributed to wage growth, with 85% of it being driven by profit growth.
So if you wanted to tackle inflation, you wouldn't really target the 15% there.
Well,
You'd go for the 85%?
I disagree. See, we should take the fin at its word and do whatever it takes, to crack down on inflation, which would mean cracking down on profits.
On profits.
Absolutely. If we're serious about it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, maybe all we're accidentally trying to do is tilt the profit wage share even further.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be a pity if we used inflation to accidentally increase profits and accidentally lower wages? No one would be that cynical, but...
Well, it brings me back also to the fact that we've had kind of low inflation for a very long time and, wages didn't rise during that period. Now is certainly not the time. Is there ever a good time, Richard?
Not according to the Business Council of Australia. You've put your finger on it. So when we have high unemployment, it's a bad time to increase wages because, that won't help the unemployed. When we have low unemployment, that won't be a good time to increase wages.
I'm sensing a theme here.
You've picked it. The reality is in Australia for the last 30 years, there's never been a good time to have a wage rise, and it's worked. That's why we've had low wage growth.
Yeah.
That's why the wage share is lowest as a percentage of GDP as it's almost ever been. So, it's interesting the way these kind of accidents just keep repeating themselves. But, we're accidentally pushing for wage restraint again.
Yeah. Now, Richard, I know the Australia Institute recently brought out Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and former chief economist of the World Bank, and you were touring around a lot of Australia with him. I'm sure he got asked a lot about inflation. What was his observation from kind of outside of Australia?
That it wasn't wages driving inflation, that it's profits, that our research, makes that same point that the European Central Bank and others have found. And in addition to agreeing with our diagnosis of the problem, he was very vocal while he was here in public and in private saying, look, increasing interest rates is not really the best way to handle this kind of inflation either. So wage growth isn't the solution. Sorry, wage reductions aren't the solution. But he argues, and I agree, that interest rates aren't really the solution either, because the thing that's driving the price increases is things like higher energy prices, some higher food prices, computer chips. There's been a shortage of computer chips, which has meant things like cars have got more expensive. And, it barely needs saying, but increasing interest rates doesn't make oil cheaper. It doesn't make cars cheaper.
Doesn't make those vegetables that have increased in price because of the floods and things any cheaper.
Well, and that's the other thing. And I think we really need to understand that climate change today, because the climate has changed. We've got to stop talking about it, how it might change. We know
in 2050.
The climate has changed, and in our changed climate, we have more floods than we used to. And those extra floods are why lettuce went to $17. And those floods are also one of the reasons that electricity got expensive, because the floods actually knocked out the railway lines that connected some of the coal-fired power stations to their to the coal mine. So that reliable baseload coal that we hear a lot about got flooded out. And that's actually helped push up electricity prices as well. So it's not just the war in Ukraine making the world price of oil higher. Here in Australia, climate change and extra floods means even less reliability for that so-called baseload power.
Well, the next time I have a KFC burger with cabbage on it instead of lettuce on my burger, I know to blame climate change and coal and gas exports. But Richard...
We warned people.
We did.
We said it'd be bad.
And we were right. Cabbage belongs on no burger. It's a hill I'll die on. Richard, what can the government and the Reserve Bank do to bring inflation under control? Obviously, the Reserve Bank's kind of got its one blunt instrument that we've already discussed probably isn't the greatest to tackle this problem. What about fiscal policy? What can the government do?
Yeah, great question. So the reason in Australia that we think it's only interest rates, that's the only lever to pull, is because that's the rule book we wrote 30 years ago. And there's nothing in an economics textbook that says it has to be that way. So the idea that monetary policy, interest rate policy, is used to control inflation, there's some people like it that way, but there's no theory that says it has to be that way. Fiscal policy, taxing and spending policy, can be used to reduce inflation. And a really simple way to do this, and again, Professor Stiglitz supports this, is to stick a windfall profits tax on the fossil fuel industry, particularly the gas industry, because, the war in Ukraine doesn't mean it's more expensive to extract gas in Australia, right? It's no more expensive for them to suck our gas out of our ground. They're just now selling it to us at a higher price.
Yeah.
So why not tax it back? So that's called a windfall profits tax. And that's a good idea, full stop. We should do that. But what do we do with that money? Well, anything we want. But if we wanted to, we could do what we did during the COVID crisis and make childcare free again. Now, when you make something free, you're lowering its price. That pushes inflation down. This would work. We could make medicines cheaper, temporarily or permanently. This would push prices down. We recently increased the HECS fees for university degrees. That pushed inflation up. We could put them back down. So there's a whole bunch of prices in our economy that are literally set by the government. And they count in the CPI in the same way that petrol does, in the same way that lettuce does. So we could use fiscal policy to collect revenue, and the obvious thing at the moment is a windfall profits tax. And if we targeted that spending on lowering the price of things government sell, we would literally get lower inflation. Problem solved. There you go, I fixed it.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Richard. That's all we've got time for today.
Anytime.
Very glad that we've solved the inflation problem for the Australian government. This episode was recorded live on Tuesday, the 26th of July, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. Our producer is Jennifer Macy, with editing from Lizzie Jack this week. Thanks, Lizzie. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.